What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch here of the Bottom Line View with my stardom and situm for week number 7 for your fantasy football teams, trying to get you more W's this season in fantasy football, this 2017 season. Of course, like every week, I'll give you 5 starts and 5 sits for the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end position. Subscribe to the channel for more fantasy football and NFL content. Let's get right into the video, starting off with the quarterback starts. Dak Prescott versus San Francisco. The 49ers have allowed 18-plus fantasy points to 3 of the last 4 quarterbacks that have faced them, scoring 22-plus fantasy points in each of his last 3 games. Dak should be very successful against the 49ers secondary that hasn't been so great this season. Marcus Mariota versus Cleveland. Cleveland has allowed the most touchdown passes, 14, and the second most fantasy points, over 20 fantasy points per game to the position this season. Expect a big one for Marcus Mariota. Cleveland is actually pretty good against the run, but their secondary lacks to hold quarterbacks to bad games. Matt Ryan versus New England. New England has actually had a record set against them this season, and that's the most consecutive games allowing a 300-yard passer. That's 6 every single game this season. They have yet to hold a quarterback under 300 yards. Matt Ryan should have a good day whether he's winning or losing this game. Jared Goff versus Arizona. The Cards rank 25th in passing yards and 28th in points this season. Now, I'm saying that the Cardinals usually pretty good against the run. Against the pass, they do have some deficiencies, specifically the one corner opposite of Patrick Peterson. A lot of teams have been able to target that area. I think Sean McVay will do the very same thing, be creative, and move the ball through the air versus the Cardinals. Kirk Cousins versus Philadelphia. 3 career games in Philadelphia have been very good for Kirk Cousins. He's completed 65% of his passes, averaged 342 yards, and thrown 9 touchdowns in 3 games. So Kirk Cousins likes to play in Philly. That's why I'm starting him this week on Monday Night Football. My quarterback sits Jameis Winston versus Buffalo. The Bills, as a team, have given up 2 passing touchdowns all season long and have only allowed 2 quarterbacks to score double-digit fantasy points this season. Jacoby Brissett versus Jacksonville. The Jags have allowed the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. No surprise here. They have the best secondary in the NFL. Andy Dalton versus Pittsburgh. The Steelers' defense has actually been pretty good this year and have only allowed just 10.3 fantasy points per game. I think the Steelers will be able to get after Andy Dalton. I expect Andy Dalton to not have his best day in Pittsburgh against the Steelers. Ben Roethlisberger versus Cincinnati. Currently on pace for Ben Roethlisberger. He's currently on pace for 19 passing touchdowns this year. That's the lowest total he's had since 2010. And in 2010, by the way, he only played 12 games. It's not looking good for Big Ben. This team has become a running team. It's no longer Big Ben's passing game that's getting them points. It's Le'Veon Bell's legs. Don't start Big Ben this week against the second best passing defense in the NFL. Eli Manning versus Seattle. Even with the win last week, Eli was not very successful through the air. Now, he did play the Broncos, but this week it gets no better because he plays the Seahawks. Seahawks are a pretty good defense as last time I checked. Eli still has no targets, so sit Eli. My running back starts this week, C.J. Anderson versus the Chargers. The Chargers are dead last against the run, giving up 154 yards per game. C.J. Anderson only had 9 attempts last week, but he should get back on track. The Broncos' game plan should be giving the ball to C.J. Anderson and letting him run with it, so I expect him to have a big game here. Derrick Henry versus Cleveland. Now, I don't usually give this advice to start Derrick Henry because he is basically the backup to DeMarco Murray, but there is a good chance of getting a touchdown in this game against Cleveland. This game at least should see the Titans score a lot of points and maybe the Cleveland Browns too, so I would expect Derrick Henry in the red zone to get some carries. Also, you have to look at Derrick Henry's success in the 4th quarter. If they are winning this game, he's been very good at breaking off long runs. Adrian Peterson versus the Rams. The Rams are allowing the most fantasy points to opposing running backs this year. AP broke out last week against the Saints. He should do the same against the Rams this week. The Cards like what they have in AP. Carlos Hyde versus Dallas. Dallas's defense has allowed 13-plus PPR points to at least one running back in every single game this season. Hyde is a staple of that offense, and if they want to keep this game close and keep Dallas off the field, they need Carlos Hyde running the football. And finally, James White and Dion Lewis versus Atlanta. Now, remember the Super Bowl for White? Yeah, he had 14 catches in that game, which is a Super Bowl record. He also had 3 touchdowns and was arguably the MVP. Also for Dion Lewis, he is now the lead back. He's been far more successful than Mike Gillislee this year, and I expect him to get more touches and in this game. So if Dion Lewis is out there, pick him up. Like I said last week, he could be another sneaky start this week, but James White is probably going to be the guy more than anyone this week for the Patriots, considering his recent success. Running back sits. Buck Allen versus Minnesota. The Vikings are the best defense against running backs this season, simply put. They also don't allow very many catches to the position, which Allen is really known for. Mike Gillislee versus Atlanta. As I said with Lewis and White, he's losing snaps to those two guys. He's no longer the lead back as well. So Gillislee is really only the red zone running back. So I wouldn't really trust him this week. I would wait for him on the bench, and he might only be a specific start against a specific sort of team from here on out. Aaron Jones versus New Orleans. The Saints have allowed the 4th fewest points per game to running backs over the past 4 weeks. I know it's hard to believe, the Saints defense, but Aaron Jones splitting time with Montgomery doesn't look too good against a team that's been pretty solid against running backs. Darkwa versus Seattle. The Hawks have allowed only 3 touchdowns and the 4th lowest amount of points to running backs this season. So Darkwa, even though he had a huge game against Denver, and I know Denver's good, but Seattle, very stingy against the run. I wouldn't expect a huge game here for the Giants back. Jets running backs versus Miami. The Finns have let just one runner this season score more than 10 points in PPR in their last 4 games. The Jets, who knows who's getting the ball, whether it's Matt Forte, McGuire, Powell, who really knows? So for me, I'm sitting all of them this week. My wide receiver starts, Alshon Jeffrey versus Washington. This is a favorable matchup. No Josh Norman for Washington this week. Alshon Jeffrey should be able to go off against whoever that second man is for Washington. And Carson Wentz has been on absolute fire. Jarvis Landry versus the Jets. Jarvis Landry, since Devontae Parker's been out, and by the way, he's out this week as well, has 13 catches for 106 yards and 2 touchdowns in the past 2 outings. He plays the Jets this week where he's been really successful, and the slot receiver has been successful in general. I think Landry will have a big day. Mohamed Sanu versus New England. He's back in the lineup. The Patriots are without Gilmore and Rowe, and they already suck at pass defense. As I said, 300 yards, 300 yards, 300 yards, so Sanu should get some of those 300 yards. Pierre Garçon versus Dallas. Dallas has surrendered 4 touchdowns and the second most PPR points to wide receivers on the road. Garçon is a good receiver. When it comes to the matchup, whenever the matchup is good, you start Garçon. Whenever the matchup is bad, you don't. It's going to be interesting to see the new chemistry with the new young quarterback, but I think he's going to get through it against Dallas and a team that doesn't really have anyone to cover him. Robert Woods versus Arizona. The Cardinals have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing receivers this year, and a lot of that has come opposite of Patrick Peterson. Remember, the Rams do have Sammy Watkins. He'll take that coverage. Robert Woods will have the weak guy on the other side and will really benefit from that. The wide receiver sits this week for me. T.Y. Hilton versus Jacksonville, Sammy Watkins versus Arizona, Randall Cobb versus New Orleans, Deshaun Jackson versus Buffalo, and Martavis Bryant versus Pittsburgh. Now, in terms of these receivers, in terms of T.Y. Hilton, he has had fewer than 60 yards in 4 of his last 6 games. Now, he's had a bunch of huge games in there, but at the same time, he has the same amount of stinkers. And usually when the matchup is not very good, like against Jacksonville, who has the best corner duo right now in the NFL and is giving up the least amount of points to the quarterback position, it doesn't sound good for T.Y. Hilton. Sammy Watkins versus Arizona. This is this week's wideout who's going to play Patrick Peterson, as I said with Robert Woods. Randall Cobb. Cobb has really been only at 60 yards or less for the entire season, and including 4 games in a row. And he's playing New Orleans, who, has been pretty good against, in terms of giving up fantasy points to slot receivers, but he has Brett Hundley at quarterback, not Aaron Rodgers. Deshaun Jackson versus Buffalo. A.J. Green is actually the only receiver at this position to score more than 9.8 standard points against the Bills. That was coming off mostly a long touchdown. I don't see that happening with Deshaun Jackson this week. he's really not in a great rhythm with Jameis Winston. That offense isn't rolling the way we thought, and Buffalo's defense is one of the best in the NFL. Martavis Bryant versus Pittsburgh. He is just way too unreliable, and oh yeah, the Bengals rank second in pass defense this year. I don't expect Bryant to have a huge day. My next 5 starts at the tight end position: Ed Dickson versus Chicago, Delanie Walker versus Cleveland, Austin Seferian-Jenkins versus Miami, Jimmy Graham versus New York, and Evan Ingram versus Seattle. So, for these starts, starting off with Ed Dickson versus Chicago, yes, he didn't have a great game last week, but he's getting a lot of targets, especially in the red zone, and Cam Newton really likes the tight end position. Also, he played Malcolm Jenkins last week, which is a tough matchup. Expect to bounce back this week against Chicago. Delanie Walker versus Cleveland. You have to start the tight end versus Cleveland. Cleveland has allowed the most catches to tight ends this season. Austin Seferian-Jenkins versus Miami. I basically told you to start him the last few weeks, and I'm continuing to roll with him. He would have had 8 more points last week if that fumble was a touchdown, and which wasn't a touchdown, which was a touchdown, which I don't know. Austin Seferian-Jenkins returned from his suspension, and since then, all he's done is rank 5th at the position in terms of fantasy points. Jimmy Graham versus New York. The Giants have allowed 1 touchdown to a tight end every single week this year. Evan Ingram, he has become the #1 option in that passing attack, and that should really remain so until someone else steps up. But Evan Ingram looks like a stud and a good pick in that first round for the Giants. So that's my start 'em and sit 'em this week in week number 7. Hope you guys enjoyed the football this Sunday. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. It's Mitch, The Bottom Line View. Subscribe, like the video. Peace out.